this idea that actually your life is defined not so much by success, because you're everyone's friend when you're successful, but by the knocks you inevitably are going to get, whether it's through losing loved ones, losing a job, losing a car, whatever it may be. You're going to get hit by blows in your life of differing magnitude. Mm-hmm. And I've always believed that how you deal with the downside of life really defines how you lead the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm. Well, the clip is very interesting because it starts out with the admission that life is brutally difficult and sometimes unbearably brutally difficult. And you can see the progressives playing with that notion. It's warped into this sense of victimization, but it does reflect some understanding of the underlying tragic reality of life. And so it's good to get that right out on the table to begin with. Say, well, you're miserable, you have your reasons, and they might be deep reasons. But if you let the misery demoralize you and make you bitter and cynical and cowardly and make you withdraw, then first of all, that's a failure in the highest sense on your part, and all it's going to do is make everything worse. And then you might think, well, what do you have to respond to that? How do you respond to that catastrophe and challenge? And the answer is, and this is what Rocky is telling his son in no uncertain terms, is like, terrible as things are, there's a lot more to you than you can possibly imagine. And that if you face those things forthrightly and with some faith and courage, then you can have the adventure of your life and prevail even over catastrophe. And that's true.
Right. So, I couldn't really get my head around why so many young people feel so anxious all the time compared to when I was young, when that wasn't really a big thing amongst my friendship group, certainly. But I reckon it's two things. One, social media, the constant bombardment of other people having a great time or looking great, often a false imagery, and that having to live up to false ideals. But also a conversation I had with Dr. Phil in America, where his explanation for it was that he said, you've got to understand that social media means that young people now are being bombarded all day long and all night long with quite shocking imagery. And he gave an example. He said, when I was young, he said, if a crocodile ate somebody on a golf course in Florida, the chances are I would never have heard about it. It probably wouldn't have made the national news, probably wouldn't have even made the state news, and I wouldn't have heard about this incident. Now, it's quite likely that a video of the crocodile eating this person would be whipping its way around social media within half an hour, and young kids would be sharing it, disseminating it, and being exposed to this constant imagery all the time of quite unsettling and shocking imagery. What do you think of that theory? And I think that in itself was adding to a sense of everything's terrible.
Well, I think it's a corollary of an information overload theory, right? I mean, one of the advantages to having the computational power we have is that everything is at your fingertips. And the disadvantage is that everything's in your face. And by everything, it might be 40 million pornographic images. Like, that's a lot. Or an endless array of tragic scenarios. And really endless. And so that's a problem. And the fundamental problem is, how do you handle the fire hose of information? And no one really knows the answer to that. But we should also point out that it's no wonder that young people are demoralized and anxious, because we're doing everything we can to demoralize them and make them anxious. So on the masculine front, we tell young boys that, well, the world's a terrible patriarchal tyranny, and all of that patriarchal tyranny, which is the whole explanation for history, has done nothing but oppress and exploit people and destroy the planet. And so that any manifestation of that masculine impulse on your part is equivalent to the world-destroying force.
Well, all masculinity now is branded toxic.
Yeah.
And I remember, I think the key moment for me came when Gillette, who'd always had these very masculine commercials with the big guy cuddling a baby or whatever it may be, they suddenly switched gears and did a campaign where it started with a lot of Me Too imagery and basically the assumption that all men are awful until they can prove otherwise. And I predicted in a column this would be a complete disaster for them. And sure enough, $9 billion later, they did a screeching U-turn and went back to the big guy cuddling the babies. Because actually, two things I think about that. One, most men are not awful, actually. And secondly,
not all the time.
No, some men are, obviously. Some women are pretty awful. But not most of them. But if you try saying that and not getting cancelled.